Dear listener, hello. Or Data are now a proud sponsor of the Quarter Hour podcast. I really am grateful to have them on board. I'll tell you a bit more about them later in the episode and how they can help your station. But today, we're having a look at, guess what? Kyle and Jackie O once again. But we're doing it this time from a business lens. Sam Buckingham-Jones is the media and marketing reporter at the Australian Financial Review here in Australia. He's put a lot of work into a lot of great stories recently, including the ongoing saga that is Kyle and Jackie O. Sam, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me, Wade. It's a privilege to be on your fine podcast.
Thank you, mate. Are you missing working in radio?
Radio was the first 5 years of my career. I worked with just about every host that 2GB has had. Or they had over that time. So, Ben Fordham, Ray Hadley, even Alan Jones, I worked with them all. I loved radio, like the immediacy of it, the feeling when you walk into the studio and there's two or three of you, and for 3 hours, you just have control of the airwaves. Like the rush you get from that can't be replicated. But I also I wanted to learn how to create the news, not just figure out how to get it out there in the most entertaining way to listeners. And so that's sort of why I went upstream to print. But radio will always be that first love, that so much excitement. So yeah, I do miss it.
You never forget your first love, Sam, as we know.
No.
But hey, this isn't the Kyle and Jackie O show where we would go into more detail about your first love. This is actually about Kyle and Jackie O and the saga. I listened to a fascinating episode of The Fin, which is the Australian Financial Review's podcast, which came out earlier this morning, in which you were interviewed about the story. And I think the business side of this is really important. I've got a couple of things I want to kind of ask you about that you mentioned. One quote immediately jumped out at me. You mentioned that ARN can't afford to pay out Kyle and Jackie O's contracts. What does that mean?
It means that the contract is so big and the liability is so large that if they wanted to get out from those contracts today, to cauterize stem the bleeding, cauterize the wounds that has been done, ARN does not have $180 million or whatever settlement those two hosts could conceivably ask from ARN. So they couldn't pay it out immediately. They don't have that cash reserves. They, their profit, they made $30 million loss last year. They don't have this sort of easy amount of money they can just pull out and pay them to go away. And then if you look at 9 years of a contract that is losing them money in a market that is currently either flat or maybe slightly declining, that's not a good outlook either. So that's what I meant by saying they can't afford to pay it out.
Yeah, and so for those of us who aren't deep in the business world as you are, is it literally a case of they don't have the money in the bank, therefore they can't? Or could they go further into debt to be able to fund it?
Oh, look, I'm sure there are options. I think, it's never as black and white as, they have no money. Like they are a listed company. They can issue capital. They can sell more shares to dilute themselves and raise some cash. So those things are possible. They're also directly in opposition with what the CEO of ARN is meant to do. Like his job is to lift their share price, which is currently at record lows. And yet, even in the last sort of year since the contract started, ARN's metro market share, metro market revenue has been in a nosedive, even compared to their rivals. Southern Cross and ARN both made about the same amount from their metro market. So, ARN with Kiss and Gold and Southern Cross with Triple M and the Hit Network, they both made about the same amount in 2024. But in 2025, there was tens of millions of dollars of difference. Like that difference is a direct reflection of this one contract that's been happening. ARN has admitted that as well. They've said, that it was softer advertising demand for Kiss. Kiss had an audience. It was a boycott, and it was this contract that made them, lose so much money against their main rival. So look, long story short, they could raise the money somehow.
Yeah, sure. And I think, the CEO is new, Michael Stevenson, ex-Channel 9, of course. And also Dave Cameron's gone in now as the head of content and Kerry Allstubb as the chief content officer. So from a management perspective, they've got pretty much a clean sheet from the people that actually did this deal. The one constant is the chair of the board, Hamish McLennan. actually was part of the deal. We know that because the famous Louis Vuitton briefcase story, which the contracts arrived in, it was him and also Kieran Davis, the CEO at the time, who were there with Kyle and Jackie O making the big offer. And he's still the chair today. Does it surprise you we haven't heard from him?
Oh, look, would you be saying much if you were the chair who signed off on this deal? Like, no, it
Good
doesn't
point.
surprise me. What surprises me is perhaps how little the coverage has focused on Hamish. Because although it is management's job to bring these plans to the board, and this is there's 5 people on this board. They're the same 5 people who have been there for the last couple of years. So all of them have some blame in this. It's also amazing to see how many people have left ARN, both executive and non-executive. They've found $55 million of cost cuts in a business that's not that big really compared to some other media businesses out there. So Kieran has gone. Hamish is chair still and is finding a way currently to clean up the mess that he is somewhat responsible for, I think. So yeah, it's had a huge impact on the business, and Hamish is the one person who made the bed and now has to sleep in it.
Yeah. And look, that's the job of a CEO and of a board and of an executive team of a publicly listed company. That's what you get paid to do. So we wish them well, because it's going to end in some form very soon, you'd think, or hopefully soon for everyone involved. Hey, one other thing, just talking about Kieran, that you mentioned in the Fin podcast this morning, which jumped out at me, and I'm not sure if I've heard about this mentioned, but you said that Kieran had been telling people privately that one of the challenges of Kyle and Jackie O going into Melbourne was that they kind of arrived at a cycle when the show was amping up in its content. Can you explain what that means?
Yeah, this was an interesting one. And so I'd start by saying no one would know the positives and negatives of the Kyle and Jackie O show better than Kieran Davis. He was CEO of ARN for 10 or 15 years. He was there for a long time. It was a coup. Yeah. He brought them over from Today FM in 2014. That was massive. Today FM arguably has never recovered from that, that massive audience shifting to the then newly created KISS network that was made for them, for Kyle and Jackie O. And what Kieran has said to people, he's not said this to me, but what he's said to people is Kyle and Jackie O, their show operates on a cycle that goes up and down like this. So they gradually get more and more risky. They gradually get a little bit more lewd and crude. And then they find the line, they sort of amp up and it escalates, and it's all very compelling. And they hit this point where they cross the line. And whether that's ACMA, whether that's a story in the Herald or something, calls them out on something they've done or said. And then they sort of self-assess and then start back down again, and then gradually amp up again. And that's just like the natural ebb and flow of how Kyle and Jackie O have had their success. And what he reflected to somebody after the Melbourne launch, which he has admitted was a disaster, is that they launched in Melbourne near the top of that cycle. So what that meant was people in Melbourne were tuning in, hearing some outrageous stuff, stuff you wouldn't hear on any other show, really sexual, graphic commentary. And they'd never heard it, and they've never been exposed to Kyle except maybe on, Australian Idol, where I'm sure he's not allowed to talk about that. And they tuned out. So, their first impression bombed, and you can only make one first impression. And so, people in with their kids in the car, not realizing that Sydney had been conditioned to tune in after they dropped their kids off at school. The sheer number of CEOs and C-suite execs in the Australian business world who I say, I did an interview with Kyle. They're like, I love Kyle. Like, I tune in after I drop the kids off. Like that, it astounds me.
Guilty pleasure.
Exactly.
Yeah. It's fascinating because, I think we all know that the Melbourne launch was, I think the exact quote was unmitigated disaster, which Kieran actually said to Kyle on stage in front of advertisers, which is interesting in itself. But I think the theory of the timing is an untold character in the story. So the timing, of course, the first timing mistake was the 7-week head start they gave Jason Lauren on Nova, which it doesn't come up in a lot in conversation, but I think is absolutely critical to the Melbourne launch story, because they effectively got rid of Jason Lauren. Jason Lauren had the chance to sow the seeds of we've been punted in the press. They got the public sentiment behind them, and they had a 7-week head start while ARN were sort of fiddling around and launching their studios in Sydney.
I don't consider that. That's a good point, actually. And then I think they put somebody in for Kiss whose sole job was to, make it go down so it would look good for Colin Jackie O. I thought they put some sort of holding person in.
Yeah, and that's right. And they spent that time kind of dithering, if you like. And at the same time, Nova played a blinder. They got the people on air. They did great marketing to say, hey, if you love Jason Lauren, they're now on Nova. So there's that timing. But this cyclical timing you talk about where the show ramps up and then gets to a point. In retrospect, maybe they could have picked a better timing to launch into Melbourne, but I guess it's one of those things we'll never know.
Would have been the exact time that the mad effing witches tuned in and heard this outrageous thing. So I think it drew all sorts of attention. And don't get me wrong, no one has played the outrageous comments to get organic publicity better than Colin Jackie O.
Yep.
But there's a limit to that. And I think if you are going to the surprisingly more conservative Melbourne listener base. I was surprised when people first told me that. It has played out exactly as they said it would. Yeah. So, I've learned a lot in this process.
I think we all have. Hey, just quickly to end up with, you spent a bit of time with Kyle. You did a profile for him for the Australian Financial Review magazine, which was, the timing was before they signed the mega contracts. How did you find him as a person?
Well, I was pretty new at the AFR at the time, and I remember thinking, I remember finding out that they were looking to sign a new contract, and I remember thinking, I'd love to break that news. Like that would be great. And I thought, how can I do that? I will pitch to do a profile of Kyle. And my initial pitch was the business of Kyle. Kyle, you have all these different business interests. You have like you have like a record label. You have all these different businesses. I'd love to learn about those. And I pretty quickly came to the realization that he doesn't really have anything to do with those. They're not really much of a factor in his net wealth, and really he's a radio guy. Like, he is through and through a radio guy, and so I literally spent a day. I went in, rocked up at his house at 5 a.m. He drove me and his agent Bruno into studio in his Bentley. I was there as he got the phone call from his EP, running through what was on the show. I interviewed him 3 times. I went in the smoke, like the ad breaks. Him and Jackie would go up onto the roof of the old building and have a smoke. We had all the chats. I interviewed him 3 times. I found him. I came to my reflection on his character was, this guy is the same character on air as he is off air, but he's about 10 or 20% dialed down off air.
Right. Okay.
So he's still funny. He still makes the sort of slightly crude joke, but it's just not as risky.
Gotcha.
And my reflection is, I challenge anyone to have a conversation with Kyle in person and not enjoy the experience. Yeah. But I did have one chat, hour-long interview with him at his house that he was at back then. Beautiful property overlooking Sydney Harbour. And I found him to be quite soft. You were speaking to somebody who was just much more, relaxed, not performing. Yeah. I found him soft was the word that I sort of reflected on him. He spoke more softly. He was just a little bit more sensitive. That was my reflection on him as a person. But it's been a very useful profile to have written, I've got to say.
Yeah, absolutely. Hey, Sam, we'd love to get you back on the pod as this story keeps playing out. I think you're doing an awesome job going into the depth of what this story is and what it means from all sides, because it is a human interest story. It's a business story. It's sometimes a political story with Kyle and Jackie O. So thank you for the work that you're doing with the Australian Financial Review. And the podcast is called The Fin. You can find it on podcast streams, wherever you get your podcast. And the episode that's out today features Sam going into a lot more detail. Thanks, Sam.
Thanks so much, Wade.
Okay, some quick liner notes to finish off with. Ordata. So Ordata have come on as a tech partner, part of our tech stack here at the Quarter Hour. If you don't know what it is, look it up, audata.io, Ordata. It's an operating system for modern media. So if you're running promotions, messaging with a community or an audience, if you want to get your engagement going with your fans, you can do it all in one place with Ordata. Check it out, audata.io. I'm heading over to Radio Days Europe next week, doing quite a few things over there. I'm running a podcasting summit. I'm also interviewing Tony and Ryan on stage in front of a big crowd, so I'm looking forward to that. And I'm running a session on Have I Got Your Attention, which is all about how brands get attention in a very cluttered environment. So I'll give you some of the highlights of that when I'm back from there. But we do have a few more episodes to get out, believe it or not, before then. Tomorrow I'm talking to a lawyer, an actual lawyer, a real lawyer, who's going to break down what contract law means in the case of Kyle and Jackie O. And would you believe next week I've put in an interview request for Jackie. That's true. An interview request for Jackie. And I'll give you the answer on that before the weekend hits. But for now, dear listener, that's been the Quarter Hour. See you soon.